Imagine the scene vividly. It's May of the year 1945, and you find yourself standing on the flight deck of the mighty USS Enterprise, amid the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The atmosphere is tense yet purposeful. The Air Boss has just dispatched a fleet of 30 formidable fighters and dive bombers, Hellcats, and Dauntless aircraft on a crucial strike mission against Japanese positions. These planes, having completed their attack runs, are now returning, but their homecoming is far from smooth or straightforward. They will eventually be back in approximately 2 hours' time, but in the meantime, many of them will be low on fuel, some already battered and shot up, and their pilots exhausted from the demanding flight. An urgent problem looms, one that threatens to claim lives if not managed carefully. Your flight deck stretches an immense 872 feet, roughly the length of 2.5 football fields, serving as a busy, chaotic parking lot for aircraft. It is a narrow, confined space with only a single entry and exit point, turning every landing and takeoff into a high-stakes game. Throughout the Second World War, every carrier operated under a perilous, intricate rhythm that could be likened to a ruthless game of musical chairs. Except here, the stakes were life and death. When planes returned from their missions, they had to land precisely one at a time on the stern of the carrier, hooking an arresting wire to halt their momentum. Immediately afterward, they would taxi forward to a parking spot near the bow, ready for the next cycle. At first glance, this process might seem simple, almost routine, but the reality was far more demanding. Each landing demanded about 90 seconds, rarely more. Meanwhile, around 30 aircraft would be circling overhead, their fuel reserves dwindling rapidly, maybe with only 20 minutes worth of fuel left. Time was a relentless adversary. Calculating the situation reveals a tense picture. 30 aircraft needing to land, each taking nearly 1.5 minutes, totals approximately 45 minutes of recovery time. And the last planes, often low on fuel, were approaching their limits, circling anxiously, risking crash landings if wires missed or procedures faltered. If even one pilot failed to catch the arresting wire and crashed on the deck, the entire operation could come to an immediate halt. Wreckage would need to be swiftly pushed overboard by the deck crew, who had no choice but to clear the space. Meanwhile, the remaining pilots, on fumes with their fuel gauges approaching empty, kept circling overhead, feeding their engines with every last drop, nerves fraying with each second ticking by. But the true nightmare was not solely the recovery process itself, it was what came afterward. Once all aircraft had been recovered and parked wingtip to wingtip from bow to stern, the flight deck resembled a congested parking garage, packed full of aircraft fully armed and fueled, with bombs and gasoline covering every available space. If the crew wanted to launch another strike immediately, they faced an insurmountable obstacle. They couldn't do so until every single aircraft was carefully repositioned, physically moved around the deck to prepare for takeoff, a task that could easily take another hour or more. During this res-potting phase, the carrier's operational capacity was effectively rendered useless, leaving it idle for between 60 and 90 minutes after each flight, a period in which its strategic value was severely diminished. This problem, known as the deck cycle conundrum, was identified and articulated clearly by Admiral Mark Mitcher in 1944 during his command of Task Force 58. It was an Achilles heel for American naval air power, constraining the carrier's ability to project sustained air strikes. By design, each carrier was capable of launching around 100 aircraft. However, the physical layout of the straight deck, an extended, unobstructed runway integrated directly into the deck, dictated a far more limited operational tempo. It meant that, despite the potential, only one major strike could be launched per day. The Japanese faced similar challenges. During the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, their carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, found themselves immobilized in the midst of recovery and rearming cycles when American dive bombers attacked unexpectedly. Their decks were packed with parked aircraft, unable to launch or land in time, which ultimately led to their sinking. The critical failure lay in the decks being frozen, trapped in the cycle of recovering, res-potting, and rearming, paralyzing their operational capacity at crucial moments. What truly kept the highest-ranking admirals awake at night was the fundamental strategic flaw lurking beneath this operational challenge. Aircraft carriers were envisioned as the new capital ships, intended to replace battleships as the core of naval strength. Unlike battleships, which could fire their guns continually during combat, carriers relied on launching brief, carefully timed strikes. But if a carrier could only deploy one attack every 6 hours, roughly 4 strikes over 24 hours, it hardly seemed to qualify as an effective weapon. Instead, it appeared to be an enormous, floating target, an expensive and vulnerable sitting duck. The U.S. Navy computed that, in a hypothetical conflict against the Soviet Navy during the late 1940s, American carriers might manage to deliver only a single strike before enemy submarines and surface ships closed the distance. After that, they would be left in a vulnerable position with an almost empty gun, an inadequate stance for true naval dominance. This predicament was a direct consequence of the straight deck design, an engineering layout that, in fact, wasn't anyone's fault specifically. It was simply how navies had built carriers from the 1920s onward, as the simplest way to create a long, unobstructed flight runway that faced directly into the wind. The requirement for a clear, long takeoff and landing strip dictated the shape and size of these vessels, making the deck's design a compromise that would forever influence their operational capabilities. All the while, these limitations fostered a relentless quest for improvements in aircraft launch and recovery techniques. But the fundamental problem of limited launch rates persisted, constraining the true potential of carrier task forces as strategic weapons of war. Prior to the devastating events of December 7, 1941, the dominant belief within naval circles was that aircraft carriers were primarily a means of projecting power swiftly over vast distances. It was an era when no one seriously questioned this concept, because there was no better alternative to confront the emerging threats in maritime warfare. For a long time, the most pressing concern was how many ships could be targeted and sunk, and the idea that aircraft could dominate the seas had gained unquestioned acceptance. However, this complacency was shattered when the loss of personnel and aircraft began to accumulate at an alarming rate, prompting admirals to closely scrutinize the reasons behind their rising casualties. They quickly realized that a significant contributing factor was fuel starvation. Pilots and crew members often found themselves unable to land on their own ships, not because of enemy action, but due to logistical failures and operational delays during the critical landing phase. It was a grim revelation that highlighted vulnerabilities previously overlooked in the planning and operation of carrier task forces. The attack on Pearl Harbor, a day that would forever alter naval strategy and the perception of carrier strength, demonstrated the devastating potential of naval aircraft within just a couple of hours. The Japanese strike aircraft managed to cripple the entire United States Pacific Fleet with remarkable efficiency, showing the destructive power carriers could wield. Yet, the true lesson emerged not from the initial attack itself, but from what transpired in its aftermath. Following the assault, the defenses and operational limits of carrier groups became painfully evident. Admiral Nagumo's fleet, consisting of 6 carriers, had launched a total of 353 aircraft in 2 meticulously planned waves starting early in the morning. By the time the final planes had returned around 10 o'clock, the decks of his carriers were overwhelmed with aircraft in various stages of recovery. This congestion made it impossible to undertake a third strike on Pearl Harbor's vital oil storage tanks and its repair facilities, targets critical for crippling the U.S. war effort. The crews needed 3 full hours to clear the decks, rearm aircraft, and respot for future launches. This pause was not just a logistical hiccup, it was a dangerous window of vulnerability. During this interval, the entire task force stood idle, exposed to potential American counterattacks. Had there been any United States carriers present in the vicinity, they could have exploited this gap in defensive readiness. Recognizing this threat, Nagumo was forced to turn his fleet around, abandoning the pursuit with his decks cluttered and his mission only partially accomplished. His carriers' flight decks, designed to launch and recover aircraft efficiently, had instead become congested parking lots, severely hampering operational tempo. This critical flaw, delays caused by deck activity, was later understood to be a fundamental weakness in carrier tactics and design. The Americans encountered this challenge firsthand just half a year later during the Battle of Midway, where the consequences of deck congestion proved catastrophic for the Japanese fleet. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had decks filled to capacity with aircraft either preparing for land-based strikes or undergoing rearming and refueling procedures. This cycle of recovery and resupply left the carriers effectively paralyzed for nearly 47 minutes, a period during which enemy aircraft arrived in overwhelming numbers. It was then that United States Navy dive bombers from the aircraft carrier Enterprise arrived on the scene. In a swift 5-minute attack, all 3 Japanese carriers were destroyed not by superior tactics alone, but because their decks were essentially immobile, unable to launch aircraft in defense. The design of the Japanese carriers, featuring a straight deck layout, turned out to be a critical weakness. This configuration made them akin to floating bombs, unable to recover or prepare aircraft efficiently during high-stakes moments. After Midway, both the American and Japanese navies began to pay keen attention to what they referred to as deck cycle efficiency. This measure analyzed how long a carrier remained non-operational, specifically, how much time it took between recoveries and subsequent launches. The findings were stark and revealing. During the Guadalcanal campaign of the autumn of 1942, the United States USS Yorktown's air group recorded an average of 93 minutes from the time all aircraft had been recovered to when the next launch could commence. Similarly, during the Battle of Santa Cruz in October of the same year, the USS Saratoga's deck cycle stretched out to about 108 minutes. The Japanese carriers presented an even more severe picture. For example, the carrier Shikoku required 2 hours and 14 minutes to complete her deck turnaround after recovering aircraft at the Eastern Solomons. Such prolonged periods of inactivity meant that these vessels spent more time shuffling aircraft around and rearming than actively participating in combat engagements. All naval commanders operating in the Pacific could clearly see that this operational inefficiency was a critical problem, an Achilles heel that compromised their ability to engage effectively and sustain offensive operations. Wade McCluskey, who had played a pivotal role in sinking the 3 Japanese carriers at Midway, authored a classified memo in January of 1943. In this document, he succinctly pointed out that carriers were well suited for single-punch attacks, but the reality was that naval combat was evolving into a prolonged, multi-round engagement akin to a boxing match with many rounds. McCluskey's analysis indicated that if Japanese and American carrier groups engaged in open ocean battles, the side that managed to launch first would likely secure victory. This was because the side that initiated the attack would impose a strike upon the enemy before the latter could recover and prepare following their own recovery cycles. The implication was clear. Naval warfare had shifted into a quick-draw contest, where initiating the attack promptly and efficiently could determine the outcome, leaving slower or less prepared forces at a severe disadvantage. By the middle of 1943, the United States Navy had made significant progress in overcoming these limitations by acquiring a fleet of new Essex-class carriers. These ships were designed with a focus on reducing deck turnaround times and increasing operational efficiency, allowing for more effective rotation and sustained combat capability. In summary, the lessons learned from Pearl Harbor and Midway fundamentally transformed the approach to carrier warfare, emphasizing the importance of operational tempo, logistical coordination, and ship design. The early experiences exposed the weakness of prolonged recovery periods and deck congestion, forcing navies to adapt quickly if they hoped to prevail in the fast-paced naval battles of the Pacific theater. Over time, technological and tactical innovations emerged that aimed to streamline carrier operations, making them more resilient and responsive in the heat of battle. During wartime operations, the process of launching aircraft from carriers, recovering them after flight, and rearming them for subsequent missions was a complex and often inefficient dance, requiring multiple vessels and meticulous coordination. In its early stages, this entire cycle was hampered by fundamental limitations. For example, a single carrier would often need to depend on the assistance of 2 others to complete the full cycle of launching, recovering, and rearming aircraft. This was a cumbersome arrangement, especially considering that ideally, One carrier should have been capable of performing all these tasks independently, thereby conserving valuable resources and increasing operational tempo. In the year 1944, Commander Joseph Clifton, who served aboard the aircraft carrier Lexington, kept detailed records of such operations. His log entries document an incident during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of that year, where American carriers launched a total of 226 aircraft in a single sortie. However, it took nearly 197 minutes, almost an hour and 45 minutes, for the entire fleet to recover all those aircraft back onto the decks. During this recovery period, 5 pilots found themselves forced to ditch their aircraft into the sea due to insufficient fuel reserves, waiting in vain for enough space to land safely. This situation was clearly unsustainable. As aircraft flew missions, crews found themselves stranded and risks increased. It was evident that something had to be changed to improve efficiency and ensure swift turnaround times. At that time, the United States Navy was already pushing the boundaries of aircraft carrier design, constructing larger and faster vessels capable of carrying 80, then 90, and eventually 100 aircraft. Such impressive numbers, however, were rendered meaningless if the carrier's decks and flight operations couldn't accommodate the necessary aircraft movements efficiently. With a deck design reminiscent of the early 20th century, stuck in what was essentially a 1925 conception, the physical limitations meant that operating a full complement of planes was hampered. If the deck geometry could not support rapid launch and recovery procedures, then expanding the number of aircraft only increased the bottleneck, producing diminishing returns on the investment in larger carriers. While the Americans faced these logistical and operational challenges in the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, the Royal Navy was quietly addressing similar issues in the Atlantic theater. British aircraft carriers, though different in size and design, faced their own set of hurdles. Their flight decks were smaller, their hangars more cramped, and they operated in the unpredictable weather conditions of the North Atlantic, where storms and fog could ground aircraft for days at a stretch. These conditions added urgency to finding more effective ways of managing flight deck operations. In early 1943, Captain Matthew Slattery, commanding the British carrier HMS Illustrious, realized that traditional straight-deck methods, where aircraft landed and took off along a flat, uniform deck, would never enable his ship to match the efficiency of American counterparts. Conventional tactics simply couldn't overcome the constraints imposed by limited deck space and adverse weather. In response, Captain Slattery embarked on experimental approaches that, at first glance, seemed almost insane. He began exploring the possibility of allowing aircraft to land even as others remained parked forward on the deck. This concept was radical. What if aircraft could land while still having other planes waiting to take off or parked along the deck? The initial experiments, conducted in March of 1943, were crude but revealing. Slattery's deck crews painted a narrow white line along the port side of the flight deck, creating a designated landing strip that bypassed the parked aircraft. Pilots approaching from the stern would aim to land along this offset path, catching the arresting wires in this unconventional zone before taxiing into the parking area. The technique succeeded only once. During this trial, a Seafire fighter aircraft came in too far to the right and clipped the tail of a stationary Swordfish amphibious biplane. The attempt was a setback, requiring reassessment and adjustments. Despite this early misfire, Captain Slattery's efforts proved a critical point. The entire width of the flight deck did not need to be reserved solely for landings or takeoffs. Instead, it was possible for aircraft to touch down on one part of the deck while others remained in different stages of operation, either still taxiing, parked, or preparing for launch. This realization was a significant step toward more efficient deck management, even if it required rethinking the traditional paradigms. The most surprising breakthrough, however, came from an unexpected source: Dennis Campbell, a civilian physicist working for the Royal Aircraft Establishment. In late 1943, Campbell was tasked with studying aircraft carrier efficiency for Admiral Ty. Through his work, he recognized that everyone was approaching the problem from the wrong perspective. Most crews and engineers thought of the carrier's flight deck like a highway or a one-lane road, one direction of traffic, one line of aircraft queuing to land or launch. But Campbell proposed a different analogy inspired by railway junctions, where crossing paths of trains could intersect at angles without conflict, provided tracks were designed correctly. Applying this idea to carrier decks, Campbell suggested angling the landing area away from the launch area, creating a network of intersecting pathways. This approach allowed two operations to happen simultaneously. Aircraft could land and be parked on one angled section while others prepared for takeoff on the opposite side. His plan, submitted in January of 1944, called for cutting the rear part of the flight deck at a 5-degree angle to port. The resulting layout would enable aircraft to land on the angled section, catch the arresting wires, and then taxi smoothly onto the designated landing side. Meanwhile, aircraft on the starboard bow could be launched without delay, significantly increasing the overall efficiency of deck operations. This innovative concept marked a major turning point in aircraft carrier design and operation, paving the way for faster turnaround times and more flexible flight routines. It demonstrated how a fundamental shift in thinking, viewing the deck as a multi-directional junction rather than a single-lane highway, could unlock new possibilities for managing aircraft movements under demanding wartime conditions. The admiral in charge was initially quite wary of the radical idea to overhaul the fundamental approach to carrier flight operations, especially by altering the very geometry of the deck, seemed to be an act of recklessness, akin to a gamble based on a rough sketch scribbled on a napkin by a physicist rather than a carefully engineered plan. Despite these reservations, the Navy's leadership agreed to conduct a trial, choosing the light aircraft carrier HMS Triumph as their test subject because it operated in the relatively less intense combat environment of the Indian Ocean. This setting allowed for experimentation without the immediate pressures of frontline combat. In August of 1944, Commander H.P. Bramwell supervised the modifications at Colombo Harbor, where workers painted a distinctive angled landing strip onto Triumph's familiar flat deck. The alterations were modest. No drastic structural changes were involved. Instead, the deck received a fresh coat of paint to delineate the new angled approach and the arresting wires. Those critical components used to quickly stop landing aircraft were simply repositioned. This simple yet innovative change aimed to test whether a sloped deck could improve the landing and launch process without complex modifications. The first test pilot to attempt landings on this unconventional setup was Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown. In his detailed account, Brown noted that approaching an angled deck initially felt profoundly unfamiliar, almost wrong, like trying to land on a carrier that was subtly turning beneath him, defying the traditional expectations of straightforward landings. Despite the psychological discomfort, the test proved successful. Brown managed to trap his aircraft safely, taxiing to the side of the deck in just 45 seconds, then clearing the landing area without incident. Meanwhile, a Corsair fighter, launched from the bow-mounted catapult, took off in the same moment, demonstrating that both operations could occur in tight sequence without interference. These promising results indicated that the Royal Navy could, with this simple modification, experiment with angled decks using existing carriers, and the tests continued quietly into late 1944 and into 1945. The outcomes from these trials were striking. The 5-degree angle helped improve landing operations significantly, yet it was still limited. The design did not provide a complete separation between launching aircraft and recovering aircraft, as planes still had to navigate through congested areas on the deck where traffic was otherwise tightly packed. Essentially, while the angled deck was a clear step forward, it was not the revolutionary change needed to optimize carrier operations. The ongoing war, however, concluded before further refinements could be made. The British had achieved promising results but could not implement extensive improvements before the end of hostilities. With Japan defeated and the war's end, the urgency to innovate on carrier decks diminished drastically. The research, which had shown promising advances in practical combat trials, was shelved, gradually becoming forgotten amidst the post-war demobilization. The fact that a proven, effective solution was available made its obscurity all the more perplexing. Its potential for future use left unrealized, gathering dust in the files of Admiral D. Fast forward to the early 1950s, where a different figure made a notable intervention. Commander Walter Boone, a test pilot in the United States Navy, grew increasingly frustrated with the prevailing belief that upcoming jet aircraft would render traditional carriers obsolete. This was a widespread thought at the time, as new jet fighters such as the F-9F Panthers and the F-2H Banshees arrived on the scene. These new jets were significantly faster, heavier, and more powerful than their propeller-driven predecessors, which created a host of new challenges. They required more deck space to land safely because their higher speeds and greater weight meant they needed longer and more carefully managed approaches. Furthermore, the increased weight reduced their margin for error during landings, making safe recovery more difficult. During this period, most aviation experts agreed that jet aircraft simply could not safely operate from straight deck carriers, the existing flat, uninclined decks, because the physics of the new jets didn't fit the old design paradigm. There was a growing consensus that either the Navy would have to undertake entirely new ships designed from the ground up with angled decks, or accept that the traditional aircraft carrier concept was fundamentally finished. However, Boone believed this consensus was flawed. His curiosity was piqued by the British experiments with HMS Triumph's angled deck and the possibilities it indicated, which is why he had diligently studied their reports, something many others in the U.S. Navy had overlooked or dismissed. Reading these experiments, Boone saw what the British had missed. The simple 5-degree angle was not enough to harness the full potential of an angled deck, especially with the new generation of jets. Instead, he argued that the deck needed to be tilted far more severely, around 8 to 10 degrees. Such a steep angle would allow a plane that missed all the arresting wires during landing to simply throttle up again and attempt another landing without the need for complex and risky bolters. This approach would drastically reduce the chances of crashes and catastrophic deck mishaps. Instead of a crash, the pilot could execute a touch-and-go, climb out safely, and reposition for another approach, all without chaos or the need to clear wreckage in the middle of a flight deck that was perceived as a battlefield during busy operations. In March of the year 1951, Boone took his bold idea directly to Rear Admiral Apollo Susk, who was overseeing the Naval Air Test Center located along the river in Patuxent, Maryland. Boone's proposal was straightforward but daring. "Prove it," was essentially Susk's response, encapsulating the challenge. Undeterred, Boone and his team swiftly moved to test their hypothesis. They acquired the aircraft carrier USS Midway, which was then docked at Norfolk, undergoing routine maintenance. With limited time, they made a few key modifications. They painted an angled landing area on her deck, offset by 8 degrees to port, and reconfigured the arresting gear to suit the new geometry. These adjustments aimed to emulate the conditions needed to validate Boone's concept of a steeper, more effective angled deck for jet aircraft. In this way, Boone sought to challenge prevailing assumptions and demonstrate that the physics of aircraft landings could be better accommodated through a different deck design, one that made the traditional problems of missed wires and dangerous bolters a thing of the past. The transformation in naval aircraft carrier design might seem deceptively simple in its concept, yet its potential to revolutionize naval aviation was profound and far-reaching. This particular shift involved the introduction of an angled flight deck, which effectively created 2 distinct runways on a single vessel, a design innovation that dramatically enhanced operational capabilities. The traditional, straight-deck carriers featured one long, linear runway extending from bow to stern, used for both launching aircraft via catapults and recovering them upon landing. In contrast, the new design employed an inclined or angled deck, where a primary landing strip was set at an 8-degree incline from the main axis of the ship, along with a straight bow section dedicated solely to launching aircraft. This configuration allowed carriers to simultaneously conduct takeoffs and recoveries, a feat that was impossible before. For the first time in the annals of naval aviation history, ships could perform these critical operations concurrently, opening a new era of efficiency and tactical flexibility. The first practical test of this revolutionary design took place in July of the year 1951. During this pioneering trial, a seasoned test pilot, Boone, personally flew the initial approach in an F-9F Panther jet. Approaching at a speed of approximately 145 knots, he advanced toward what appeared, at first glance, to be a deck gradually turning away from him. Despite this, Boone skillfully caught the three-wire arrestor system, executing a flawless trap, and then taxied to a designated parking area on the port side of the deck. Remarkably, while he was still in motion, another Panther aircraft launched from the bow catapult, demonstrating the simultaneous operation capability. Mere 30 seconds after that, a third jet successfully trapped on the angled deck, and the cycle of launches and recoveries continued. The sequence of flight operations that previously would have taken over an hour, roughly 90 minutes, was now accomplished in a continuous, uninterrupted flow over approximately 18 minutes. The measurement for this was 12 aircraft landings and 12 launches within that brief span. To put this into perspective, attempting to replicate the same rhythm on a traditional straight deck would have taken well over an hour of sustained effort. What truly convinced everyone of the system's efficacy, however, was an intentionally staged incident during these tests. Boone deliberately missed all 4 wires of the arresting system during his 7th approach, a maneuver known as boltering. Under normal circumstances, such a mislanding on a traditional, straight deck would be considered a critical emergency. It could mean a catastrophic crash into all the parked aircraft, which often amounted to several $1 million worth of valuable equipment, with the potential for loss of life. Yet, on the angled deck, Boone responded by simply increasing throttle, lifting off, and climbing away safely without incident. During this entire process, the deck crew's response was imperceptible. No panic, no disruptions. On his subsequent pass, Boone successfully trapped the aircraft, demonstrating that the system was not only safe, but also incredibly resilient. From the vantage point of the ship's island, observers immediately understood the significance of what they were witnessing. The angled deck was far more than a mere improvement in efficiency. It eradicated the most perilous failure mode in carrier aviation, the inability to safely recover aircraft under adverse conditions or mishaps. The successful tests conducted in July established the fundamental geometry. Subsequent tests in August confirmed that this innovative layout was compatible with multiple aircraft types, further validating the design's versatility. By early September of the same year, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics was actively drawing up plans to retrofit every existing carrier in the fleet with this new angled deck configuration. In essence, the development of this single feature, supported by a dedicated test pilot and a can of paint, had the potential to double the tactical firepower of the United States Navy's fleet, dramatically increasing strike capabilities without the need for larger ships or more aircraft. While simply painting the angled deck onto the USS Midway's flight deck proved the concept's viability, transforming the idea into a permanent feature across the entire fleet proved to be an immense engineering challenge. The process entailed a monumental effort that would span 3 years, consume hundreds of millions of dollars, and fundamentally force the Navy to reconsider and re-engineer many aspects of carrier construction and design. The principal complexity was not merely cutting the deck at an 8-degree angle. It was the fact that every system, component, and structural element on a carrier had been originally designed around a traditional straight-line deck layout for more than 3 decades. Any alteration to the deck's angle necessitated a comprehensive reevaluation and modification of the entire vessel's architecture. The first major obstacle was the aircraft carrier's island superstructure, the command tower and control center positioned on the starboard side of the ship, usually around the midship section. In the conventional, straight-deck design, this placement was optimal because it allowed a clear, unobstructed runway directly down the ship's centerline. With the incorporation of the 8-degree angled deck, the entire recovery pathway was now aligned at an angle relative to the island, meaning incoming aircraft approached from a direction that led directly toward the island structure itself, rather than away from it. This situation created a significant problem. The approach path to landing now intersected the island's location, posing potential conflicts and safety concerns for both aircraft and personnel. Recognizing this, naval architects and engineers at the New York Naval Shipyard dedicated 6 months in late 1951 to carefully analyze whether the existing island could be physically relocated, redimensioned, or perhaps made less visually obstructive, possibly by making it transparent through innovative design solutions. Throughout this period, extensive calculations, structural assessments, and design considerations were undertaken. The challenge was to balance the need for a functional, stable command tower with the critical requirement to ensure safe aircraft recoveries, all while maintaining the overall integrity and seaworthiness of the vessel. This process represented a monumental shift in carrier design, as it required alterations to systems and structures deeply integrated into the ship's architecture. The solution was not straightforward, and after months of rigorous analysis, the engineering teams were faced with the daunting task of reconfiguring a warship's fundamental layout while preserving its combat effectiveness and operational integrity. This phase of design evolution marked a pivotal moment in naval engineering, illustrating the immense scope of modifications needed to realize the promise of the angled deck. The stakes were high. These modifications had the potential to set new standards for carrier construction and influence naval strategy globally for decades to come. Ultimately, the efforts laid the groundwork for a future where aircraft carriers could operate more safely, efficiently, and with greater tactical flexibility, redefining what was possible in naval aviation. The approach they ultimately chose to resolve the complex engineering challenges was a strategic compromise that involved multiple modifications. The plan entailed shifting the entire island structure slightly aft, which is toward the rear of the ship, and expanding the deck on the port side, the left side when facing forward, to create a wider, more accommodating angled landing area. This adjustment was not simply a matter of design preference. It required precision cutting into the ship's hull and the reinforcement of key structural frame members to maintain integrity and safety. Because of these substantial alterations, every aircraft carrier undergoing such a retrofit would need a prolonged period, specifically about 4 months, stationed in dry dock solely dedicated to performing the extensive structural work necessary for these modifications. The second significant obstacle lay in updating the arresting gear system. This system, critical for safely stopping aircraft as they land, consisted of hydraulic machinery designed to operate with a specific orientation perpendicular to the ship's centerline. The wires and machinery were carefully integrated into the deck, with precise mechanical and hydraulic configurations. The complication arose from the decision to tilt the deck at an angle of 8 degrees, which meant rethinking the entire arresting system's design. This change required rerouting hydraulic lines, countless adjustments to the positioning of the machinery beneath the deck to accommodate the new layout, and extensive rebuilding efforts to ensure proper functionality. Robert Decker, a senior aircraft systems engineer at Grumman, calculated that approximately 40% of the arresting gear infrastructure on each carrier retrofit needed removal and complete replacement, an enormous task that involved precise engineering and significant resource investment. For example, USS Antietam's conversion in 1952 alone absorbed nearly 11,000 man-hours solely dedicated to this arresting system overhaul. Meanwhile, the challenge of updating the launching system, the catapults, turned into a remarkable opportunity. The Navy had been experimenting with steam catapults that could generate far greater thrust than the older hydraulic systems, which made launching heavier aircraft more feasible. Incorporating these new steam-powered catapults into the retrofit provided a timely upgrade, aligning perfectly with the needs of the redesigned flight deck. Commander C.C. Kirkpatrick, overseeing USS Antietam's transformation, realized that installing steam catapults at the bow, the front of the ship, and integrating the angled landing deck would allow carriers to launch and recover heavier aircraft simultaneously. This was an important step forward in carrier capability. However, the process of installing steam catapults was complex. It involved cutting into the deck plates, running high-pressure steam lines from the ship's boilers, and constructing dedicated machinery rooms beneath the deck to house the new equipment. What began as a simple modification to the deck's angle quickly escalated into a comprehensive overhaul, effectively transforming the entire flight deck into a modern, high-capacity launch and recovery platform. Adding to these challenges was the installation of the mirror landing system, an optical device designed to provide precise guidance to pilots approaching the angled deck. Developed in Britain in 1952, this system employed a gyrostabilized mirror and a series of lights to help pilots judge their glide slope during landing. Installing this highly sensitive optical system presented its own set of difficulties. It required meticulous calibration to match the newly set 8-degree deck angle, and the mirror had to be positioned accurately so that pilots could see it clearly during their approach, which was slightly offset due to the angle. Lieutenant Commander J.R. Lamb, a test pilot assigned to evaluate the system on USS Antietam, encountered serious issues early on. During initial testing, he crashed twice because the mirror's placement caused false glide slope indications, confusing the pilots. Moving the mirror into the correct position proved to be a painstaking process, and it required 3 separate adjustments before the system functioned reliably. Between 1952 and 1955, the Navy undertook the major project of converting 13 Essex-class aircraft carriers into angled deck carriers, an essential modernization. Each of these extensive conversions carried an enormous financial cost, ranging from approximately $8 million to $12 million per vessel, an investment that was particularly significant considering the original cost of a new ship, which was around $70 million. For example, USS Bennington was taken into the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in January of this particular year and remained there until September, undergoing a comprehensive overhaul. Similarly, USS Hornet's retrofit lasted about 7 months. These weren't minor upgrades. The entire process involved cutting away sections of the original deck, welding in new structural components, and rerouting every major system on board: power, hydraulics, communications, and more. The ships emerging from these transformations were fundamentally different from the ones that had entered, virtually rebuilt from the inside out. Though from a distance, they retained much of their original outward appearance. This vast engineering effort marked a significant leap forward in carrier design, laying the groundwork for modern, more efficient naval aviation operations. In December of the year 1952, the USS Antietam set sail from the naval port of Norfolk, marking a historic milestone as the world's first operational aircraft carrier equipped with an angled flight deck. This innovative design aimed to revolutionize carrier operations, and Antietam was now heading directly into the crucible of combat in Korea to test whether Boone's pioneering geometric concept could withstand the intense pressures of real wartime conditions. The question was simple yet profound. Did this new configuration truly work under fire? Or was it merely another promising idea destined to fall apart when faced with the chaos of battle and the reality of hostile fire? Within the ranks of the Navy's leadership, opinions were sharply divided. On one side, there were those who firmly believed that the angled deck represented the future of naval aviation, a significant breakthrough that could dramatically enhance the efficiency and safety of carrier operations. On the other side, skeptics argued that this modification was an expensive experiment that might jeopardize the lives of pilots and crew, perhaps even increasing the risks during crucial landings and recoveries. With only about 4 months to resolve this debate, the vessel's crew was about to demonstrate the true potential and possible pitfalls of this revolutionary design. Arriving off the coast of Korea in January of 1953, Antietam wasted no time, immediately launching into combat missions against North Korean and Chinese military targets. Commanded by Commander William Sisko, the ship's air boss, the crew maintained an extraordinary level of meticulous record-keeping, aware that decision-makers back in Washington were scrutinizing every detail. During the initial week of operations, the crew established baseline operational figures. The carrier managed to launch and recover a total of 68 sorties within a span of just 12 hours. At first glance, this might seem modest. However, when compared to her sister ship, USS Courage, a straight-deck vessel operating just 50 miles to the south, which managed only 39 sorties during the same period, the significance became clear. Both ships carried the same air groups, deployed identical aircraft types, and performed similar mission profiles. Yet Antietam, with her angled deck, produced approximately 74% more combat activity from the same resource. The difference became even more apparent when examining what pilots referred to as deck availability, a crucial measure of how often the flight deck was truly ready to accept aircraft for landing. On straight-deck carriers operating amidst the Korean conflict, deck availability averaged around 42%. In practical terms, this meant that pilots launching for strike missions were essentially gambling on a 50-50 chance that the deck would be clear upon their return. If the deck was occupied or not ready, pilots faced the unpleasant prospect of wasting precious fuel while circling in the vicinity or diverting to emergency landing fields on the Korean peninsula, an often dangerous and unpredictable scenario. Conversely, Abil's aircraft on Antietam with her angled deck enjoyed a remarkable improvement. Her deck availability soared to nearly 79%, providing pilots with a much greater sense of assurance that they could land safely back on the ship without unnecessary delays or hazards. At first glance, these statistics might seem like mere numbers, but for those in the cockpit, they translated directly into lives saved and missions successfully completed. Lieutenant James Miker, who would later become a noted author, was flying the Navy's F-9F Panthers off Antietam in February of 1953 when he personally witnessed the life-saving capabilities afforded by the angled deck. During one afternoon, he saw an incident that underscored how revolutionary this design truly was. A Sky Raider returning from a close air support mission sustained battle damage and approached the carrier too fast, too hot, and with too little space. Yet in a situation where the straight deck configuration would have resulted in tragedy, the aircraft managed to bolt through all 4 wires without crashing. On Antietam's angled deck, the pilot easily flew off the port side, climbed out of the aircraft, dumped fuel to shed weight, and was able to trap on a subsequent pass, effectively avoiding a catastrophic accident. That same day, another emergency unfolded involving an F-9F aircraft with hung ordnance, a bomb that refused to jettison because its arming wire had pulled loose, leaving the bomb live and dangerous. Under traditional expectations, a straight-deck carrier would be unable to safely land a plane in such a hazardous state, especially with other parked aircraft directly in front. It was too risky. But on Antietam with the angled deck, the pilot was allowed to land immediately without concern for disaster. The deck was clear and ready, and the aircraft touched down safely, demonstrating that multiple variables in carrier operations could be significantly safer with this new design. Further astounding incidents occurred, each highlighting the versatility and safety improvements that the angled deck offered. One such case involved a pilot suffering from spatial disorientation, approaching the deck well off centerline and nearly touching down on the port side, dangerously close to the island. On a traditional straight-deck carrier, such an error would typically mean catastrophe, possibly resulting in a crash into the island or runway equipment. However, on Antietam's angled deck, the pilot was able to glide in more normally and make a safe trap despite the disorientation, a feat that underscored the practical benefits of the design. By the beginning of March of 1953, Commander Sisko's detailed logs reflected the profound impact of these innovations. The figures showed that Antietam was flying an average of 89 sorties per day, a substantial increase from the 47 sorties logged on the straight-deck carriers operating nearby. This nearly doubled daily operational tempo demonstrated beyond doubt that the angled deck was not just a technical novelty, but a true game-changer in carrier aviation, dramatically amplifying combat power and operational efficiency during wartime. In the early days of modern naval aviation, the United States Navy sought to dramatically enhance the offensive capabilities of its aircraft carriers. To evaluate potential improvements, Commander John Cromlin was dispatched to observe operational procedures firsthand and report his findings directly to the Chief of Naval Operations. His telegram was succinct yet compelling, delivering a clear message. Implementing an angled flight deck could significantly boost a carrier's striking power by at least 85%. This assertion was based on rigorous analysis and practical testing, and it carried substantial weight. At that time, most existing carriers had a straight, unaltered deck, and these vessels were operating at only about half their true potential, with their limited design constraining their combat effectiveness. Recognizing this, Cromlin recommended that all fleet carriers urgently undergo a conversion process to incorporate angled decks. Such a transformation was essential if they were to keep pace and maintain dominance in the emerging era of jet-powered naval warfare. The initial response from skeptics in Washington was swift and quiet. They quickly realized the implications of this proposal and, in the face of the compelling evidence, tempered their doubts. The pivotal factor that convinced even the most cautious officials was a quantitative measure adopted early that year, in April, namely, the metric called mission effectiveness cycles. This innovative measurement tracked how many complete operational sequences, comprising strike launches, recovery, rearming, and relaunching, each carrier could execute within a 24-hour period. Traditional straight-deck carriers barely managed an average of 2.3 cycles in the same time frame, but the newly modified ships with angled decks, exemplified by the USS Antietam, demonstrated an impressive capacity for up to 4.1 cycles. In essence, Antietam was performing the workload of two carriers, making her a force multiplier. The engineering insights that Captain Boone had visually proven with paint in the early 1950s were now confirmed in the real, visceral terms of combat, through bloodshed and bombs, during the Korean conflict in the year 1953. The clear effectiveness of the angled deck concept rendered earlier debates on the subject moot, and by the end of that year, the Navy had resolved to pursue an even more ambitious course. Instead of merely retrofitting existing carriers, they embarked on designing a brand new class of warship from the ground up, with the angled deck as the core principle embedded into the ship's very structure. These forging innovations resulted in the emergence of the Forrestal-class supercarriers, pioneering vessels that would be the first warships in history explicitly built with an angled deck as the fundamental element of their design, rather than as an afterthought or retrofit. Every other aspect of the ship, from propulsion systems and armor protection to armament configurations and crew accommodations, was meticulously engineered around maximizing the benefits of that specific 8-degree inclined runway. When USS Forrestal was launched in December of 1954, her physical appearance vividly demonstrated these technological advancements. From the pier, one could see that her angled landing zone was no longer merely painted lines on a flat deck, but was an integrated structural component, incorporated through reinforced deck plating along the designated landing area, specially rated to withstand the impact of jet aircraft. Furthermore, the island, the command tower atop the carrier, was positioned further aft than on any previous vessel, providing pilots with a clear, unobstructed approach to the angled deck, thereby improving safety and operational efficiency. The ship was equipped with 4 steam catapults, 2 located on the bow and 2 on the angled midsection, allowing her to launch for aircraft every single minute, or 1 every 15 seconds. Simultaneously, she could recover aircraft from the landing area, showcasing a feat of logistical coordination and engineering precision. The theoretical maximum sortie rate for such a vessel was calculated at an astonishing 170 aircraft sorties daily, an order of magnitude greater than the approximately 90 maximum sorties achieved by any carrier during World War II. Captain Roy Johnson, overseeing trials aboard Forrestal during her shakedown procedures in 1955, confirmed that every design decision had been validated in real-world conditions. During a particularly demanding test off the Virginia Capes in August, the carrier's air wing launched a 40-plane strike, recovered 32 aircraft from the previous attack, and simultaneously launched a 20-plane combat air patrol, all within a span of merely 47 minutes. These operations involved the deck crew managing 3 distinct tasks concurrently: launching aircraft via catapults from the bow, recovering aircraft on the angled deck with arresting gear, and towing or refueling aircraft parked in the forward deck park. The chaos was controlled and highly efficient, largely due to the carefully planned geometry of the deck layout, which kept different operational phases mechanically separated and synchronized. The strategic and tactical implications of these innovations soon reverberated across the globe, striking Soviet naval planners like a forceful blow. Previously, they believed that American aircraft carriers were highly vulnerable during flight operations, especially during the vulnerable moments when aircraft were either launching or recovering, moments when their shipboard defenses could be overwhelmed by an enemy attack. This vulnerability was rooted in the assumptions that the straight deck layout limited tactical flexibility and created predictable procedural vulnerabilities. However, the advent of the angled deck, exemplified by the Forrestal class, flashed a glaring weakness in their assumptions. The new design effectively nullified that vulnerability, forcing Soviet strategists to reconsider their approaches to countering American naval air power, as these ships could now launch and recover aircraft with greatly diminished risk of attack during critical phases. Throughout modern naval history, The threat posed by aircraft carriers has never really been fully neutralized because, in reality, these formidable ships have never truly been rendered vulnerable. Instead, they have continually evolved, revealing that efforts to extinguish their operational effectiveness have consistently fallen short. To illustrate this point, Soviet Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, in an insightful assessment penned back in 1956, emphasized that NATO's carrier groups, specifically those centered around the formidable Forrestal-class vessels, possessed the capability to sustain uninterrupted offensive strikes against Soviet forces. Gorshkov's analysis painted a rather grim picture. The Soviet surface navy lacked any effective means of countering these megacarriers, which strove to launch as many as 100 combat sorties daily, an operational tempo that could be maintained indefinitely. Supporting Gorshkov's concerns, the numerical data of that era underscored the increasing dominance of these powerful ships. By the year 1959, a total of 4 Forrestal-class carriers had become operational: the USS Forrestal, USS Saratoga, USS Ranger, and USS Independence. Each of these colossal vessels boasted an air wing composed of approximately 90 aircraft, a number that, when combined, allowed for sortie rates comparable to the collective output of 3 carriers from the preceding World War II period. Evidently, the scale and power of these carriers represented a seismic shift in naval warfare capabilities. Further evidence of their formidable nature appeared during NATO training exercises conducted in 1960. During such maneuvers, a single Forrestal aircraft carrier's air wing managed to fly a total of 147 sorties over just 24 hours, which included operations conducted through the night. This staggering level of activity highlighted the practical challenges faced by maintenance crews, especially on straight-deck carriers like Forrestal. The perpetual cycle of launching and recovering aircraft on a flat, unangled flight deck created a constant and intense workload for maintenance personnel. Unlike modern designs where aircraft can be retrieved with relative ease, on these early carriers, working on aircraft was a persistent challenge due to the deck's relentless oscillation between launch and recovery phases. However, on the USS Forrestal, efforts to address this issue led to a significant breakthrough. The forward deck park, a designated area where aircraft could be parked and maintained, was reimagined as a stable, accessible space. This innovation allowed maintenance crews to repair and service planes while flight operations continued seamlessly around them, effectively transforming the carrier's operational paradigm. This refashioning of the deck management system enabled a dramatic doctrinal evolution. Prior to the adoption of angled flight decks, carrier groups had to maintain a considerable distance from potential threats, as they required extra space and time to recover aircraft after each strike, making them vulnerable. The new capabilities introduced by Forrestal and her sister ships meant they could operate in closer proximity to their enemies, since these vessels could simultaneously defend themselves, launching fighter interceptors, while conducting attacks and recovering strike aircraft, all while being fueled for subsequent sorties. Vice Admiral John McCain Jr., in a briefing from 1961, aptly described this revolutionary capability as the rolling thunder. He meant it in a literal sense, emphasizing the continuous, relentless nature of air power projection these carriers could now sustain. Instead of occasional, isolated strikes, these ships could project persistent aerial dominance, establishing an unbroken presence that had previously been unattainable. One simple but profound change, adoption of the angled flight deck, had resulted in a system that would come to dominate naval warfare for at least the next half-century. Looking across the span of nearly 74 years, the design principles laid out during the early days of the angled flight deck continue to underpin modern carrier architecture. For example, if one steps onto any current carrier deck, whether from the Nimitz or the Ford class, the core geometry remains essentially unchanged from the ideas first introduced by Admiral Forrestal in 1951 and visualized by pioneering naval architect Commander Robert Boone at Midway. The 8-degree inclined landing surface is still present, offering a safe and reliable angle for aircraft to land without interruption. The powerful steam or electromagnetic catapults are still positioned in roughly the same spots, facilitating swift aircraft launch sequences. On the port side of the deck, The optical landing system continues to guide incoming aircraft accurately to the landing area, a technological fixture that has remained largely unaltered for more than 7 decades. Remarkably, despite technological leaps and the construction of newer carriers, nobody has formulated a better solution than the original angled deck concept, because the initial design was fundamentally sound and highly effective. This rarity in military technology, finding a solution so well optimized that it withstands the test of time, is almost unique. The USS Gerald R. Ford, commissioned in the year 2017, exemplifies the latest evolution of this lineage. Claimed to be the most advanced aircraft carrier ever constructed, the Ford class comes with a price tag of approximately $13 billion. It incorporates state-of-the-art electromagnetic catapults, designed to cycle faster and more reliably than traditional steam-powered systems, as well as advanced arresting gear and a nuclear reactor capable of powering the ship for half a century without the need for refueling. Yet, despite the impressive technological enhancements, her flight deck retains the iconic 8-degree angled landing area inherited from the 1950s, an enduring feature of carrier design. The Ford is capable of launching and recovering around a third more sorties than her Nimitz-class predecessors, thanks primarily to the faster cycle times of her advanced electromagnetic catapults and the streamlined nature of her cruise operations. It's important to note that this increase in sortie generation is not due to a revolutionary change in the deck's fundamental layout. Instead, it is due to improvements in the systems, the electromagnetic catapults that operate more swiftly and efficiently, requiring less time between launches, while the core structure, which enables simultaneous launch, recovery, and replenishment operations, remains essentially unchanged. This indicates that the foundational layout, based on decades-old principles, remains as effective today as it was when first introduced, precisely because it was designed with timeless efficiency in mind. The fundamental principles of naval aviation remain consistent, and what was once considered an innovative breakthrough continues to prove its relevance and durability even decades later. Modern aircraft carrier operations are conducted at a pace that would have seemed utterly astonishing to the admirals of the World War II era. For instance, during Operation Inherent Resolve against ISIS forces in the year 2016, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower managed to sustain an extraordinary tempo, executing roughly 3 or 4 sorties per day for an unbroken stretch of approximately 7 months. Over this period, the dedicated air wing flew around 12,000 combat missions without experiencing a single operational loss attributable to deck mishaps or recovery issues. This high level of operational confidence meant that pilots could launch their missions knowing with certainty that the flight deck would be prepared and ready for their return each time, maintaining a seamless cycle of launching and recovery. This same confidence, mirrored from the era of the Korean War in the early 1950s, was rooted in the same foundational design, the angled deck, which revolutionized carrier aviation. Its implementation effectively removed an entire category of hazards and fears associated with landing fast-moving aircraft on a floating platform at sea. The innovation was so profound that it didn't remain unique to one Navy or one carrier design. Instead, it became a blueprint swiftly adopted by virtually all modern naval forces worldwide. When the Chinese Navy's first indigenously built carriers, the Liaoning and the Shandong, entered service, both incorporated angled decks as a critical feature. Similarly, India's INS Vikramaditya was constructed with this design in mind. Even smaller ships designed for amphibious assault operations, like the American-class and Queen Elizabeth-class carriers, which deploy aircraft that land vertically and do not necessarily require an angled deck for landing, still include it. They adopt the angled geometry because it enhances deck flow, streamlines aircraft movement, and simplifies handling procedures. In essence, the underlying design principle transcended its original purpose, transforming into a universal standard for any vessel that operates fixed-wing aircraft. Its influence extends far beyond its initial context and has persisted long past the technological era for which it was initially conceived. The concept has remained resilient because it is rooted in the fundamental physics of landing an aircraft with forward momentum on a dynamic, moving platform. The physics of trajectory, angle, and momentum haven't changed, and thus, the angle deck continues to serve a critical role. As long as aircraft carriers remain a vital element of naval strategy, and as long as aircraft need runways, the angle deck will be an essential feature. What makes this innovation even more remarkable is its simplicity. An elegant, geometric solution, an approximately 8-degree tilt of the landing surface, effectively addressed a critical challenge that naval strategists and admirals once believed could only be tackled through completely new ships or revolutionary technological advances. It required no exotic materials, no complex computer systems, and no advanced engineering techniques that only a few countries could develop. Instead, it was achieved by a straightforward rotation of the landing area, which unlocked a host of safety and operational improvements. Unbeknownst to Commander Boone, who devised this concept around 1951, he was laying the groundwork for what would become the standard layout for the next 100 years of naval aviation. His primary motivation was simply to improve pilot survivability and increase the usefulness of aircraft carriers. Yet, this modest goal led to a profound and enduring change, an innovation so effective that it became woven into the very fabric of naval operations. Often, the best innovations follow a similar pattern. They solve immediate, pressing problems so effectively that they inadvertently become permanent fixtures, reshaping the landscape far beyond their original scope. Standing on an aircraft carrier deck in the year 2025, one is metaphorically standing on a piece of that same enduring legacy from 1951. The design details, including the tilted, angled deck, continue to underpin the entire system, a testament to the fact that no significant advances have rendered it obsolete, because nothing else has addressed the core challenge of landing high-momentum aircraft on a moving platform better or more simply. The implementation of the angled deck not only doubled the strike capacity of aircraft carriers, but also eradicated the most dangerous failure mode in naval aviation, the disastrous accidents that could occur during landing or recovery. Its development laid a solid platform for an era of unmatched U.S. naval dominance stretching over 7 decades. This achievement, remarkable in its simplicity, was realized with nothing more than some careful geometry and a splash of paint, a reminder that sometimes the most elegant solutions are the least complicated but most impactful.